mind.
Is it pronounced that way?
No, it's pronounced WOUT.
Okay.
But
It's
like Americans
WOUT.
can say wow and they can say cloud, but they
Anyway.
can't say WOUT. It's wow.
He's a fun person to talk to. He has some awesome interviews on our channel. We were just talking about some. I'm gonna rapid fire questions to him. I wanted him to do a video with me about teaching something to me, and I'm gonna figure out what I want him to teach me in a bit, but we're just gonna talk about modern events. Which is probably not gonna go well. So first of all, it's gonna be like a podcast thing.
Good.
What do you think about Chelsea quitting FD?
Oh, that's a good question.
I'm gonna ask him modern questions, and he's gonna answer
I
quickly.
love the podcast style because like I've been driving 36 hours to get here, and I've only been listening to podcasts. So awesome if people listen to this like a podcast. Chelsea quitting FD. I think what it made really clear to me was the clash of the online world, right? Like how people perceive Chelsea, and like people like yourself, you basically grew up with Chelsea in your adult life. You guys were like, when did you guys meet? When he was 18 and you were 20 or something like that?
He was probably 16 or so,
16,
and I'm a good bit older than him, so I was probably in my early 20s.
Yeah, so like you know him, right? You guys went to Japan, you basically were at almost, I could say you were at the cradle of his career. Like he came to your events in Texas, you guys drove together, you guys did all these things, right? So you really know him. I know him a little less, obviously, but we've always been buddies, and he obviously played a big role in my whole Drift Week thing.
Oh, he built your car for you.
Built my
I
car.
forgot about that.
Sourced my car. So
he
he found
sourced
my
it
car.
and built the E46 M3 that he's used on this entire trip.
He actually took it
and
to
delivered it to the first event.
Yeah.
Okay.
He
So
took it to FD actually.
Oh, did he?
The first picture of my M3 was in the RTR, like right in front of the RTR pit at Seattle, because he grabbed it when he was on his way to FD Seattle. Oh. And he took it into the paddock, like Monroe, right? Or Washington, yeah, Monroe. So that's where he had all these semis lined up. And that's the first picture Chelsea sent me when he acquired. I'd seen the pictures when he was going to buy it.
That probably made you like feel special and excited.
Well, the whole thing changed
Since
my
you're
life.
an FD fan and everything. All right,
I'm an
go
FD
back
fan.
to the subject.
So, the subject,
I have to
Chelsea,
keep you,
yeah. So for me, obviously it was a huge social media thing, right? Everybody's talking about it, and you could see the big split between the online community that looks at Chelsea as like this BMW guru, this suspension guru, this FD driver, and there's people like you and me to a lesser extent that know him in real life and speak with him, and there you can see this big difference in how people are perceived and how they really are, because everyone's like, he's 100% going to do Drift Masters. He's finally going to do Drift Masters with LZ, with two E36s, and there's this whole story, and everybody was like, yeah, that's what's going to happen. But, if you know him a little bit, he just did so much of this comp driving because he wanted to drive with the best drivers, and I feel he deserved a good team. And I think he just doesn't want to do any comp drifting right now. He doesn't want to be in another series SMD. He just wants to do something completely different. And he made the whole video with Vaughn. I think that was last week. Awesome video. If you haven't seen it, watch it. I
watched some of it.
It was awesome. It was a fantastic.
I have a baby though, so it's hard to watch a 40-minute video.
Yeah, well, I think that's a video that's like almost mandatory for people to watch before they comment on the subject, because they basically spoke about everything. And Vaughn is, for me, gone up in my book. Every year he goes up because he's such a good leader, good team. I'm a team manager myself, so I look at guys like Odie, who is an amazing team manager, obviously had a really successful year. RTR, probably the most successful drift team in the world right now with how they
Did you need me? Edit that out. Okay, keep going.
Maybe leave it in. People won't understand.
Yeah.
It's a horrible podcast.
All right.
Anyways,
back to your point.
So back to my point. People should watch that video, and there Chelsea explains all these things, and I think he makes it really clear that like.
Yeah, but what do you think about it? You're just explaining about what he said.
That's
How
what
do you think?
That's what I thought about that.
What do you think about the highest ranked drifter in the world right now stepping out of competitive drifting? That's the real question. Highest ranked drifter in Formula D, just like Samuel Hubinette, just like Reese Millen, just like Tanner Faust. I think all those guys won. Boom, they win, they're out onto something else.
But it wasn't like that, because that's what was a really good thing. He pronounced that he was going to quit before he was a champion. So I think that was really smart. So if he wouldn't have won a championship, he still would have quit. I think that was a really smart move by him. So it's not like he's just waiting, I'm finally FD champ, now I can quit. That's apparently not what it's like, because he was going to quit anyways, and he announced it before for that reason. So I think he just, like, his job is like so hard, because you're not only doing FD, but you're doing all these demos and all these crazy videos at like Little Talladega and these tailgate videos that they did, and like all this stuff, his own content, obviously his own channel. So I feel like he's done that for so long, you know, that it's almost like, at what point are you going to say it's not like 3-time champion? Like, are you going to make 100 videos with RDR? You're going to make 200 videos? Like, you're also a person, right? You got to have your personal development and your personal goals that are maybe outside of drifting, or outside of professional drifting or comp drifting. And yeah, so I totally understand that, because it's a lot of work. Like, it's not just show up. Like, people think it's like so easy. Oh, he just shows up and the car is all ready and it's good to go. And it's a lot of work. Like, they have all these meetings and like discussions with that team, because they're all professional guys, right? It is a job that takes way more time off of you, traveling, all that stuff, you know, doing the demos for Ford and Pennzoil and SEMA and everything. So I think that's more of the thing why he quit, you know, because that's like, who wants to live that life who can do that life forever?
All right, next question.
Yeah.
Too sticky of tires in Drift Masters.
I think it's a bad thing, because it...
Name the tire.
I'm not going to name the tires. I mean, I think everybody sees right now that... So just in a really quick history, the way I see it, it's my view, it doesn't necessarily have to be anybody else's. I feel like in the early 2000s, like, let's say the second half of 2005 onwards, cars were like stock M3s in Europe, like M3 3.2s, or like a V8 swappy 30, and you could win everywhere in Europe. Then guys started to do crazier motors, 2Js, LS, turbo BMWs, all that stuff started coming, right? This is like probably early 2010, 2011. It took up until 2012, 2013 for those guys to get them reliable, right? And remove all the kinks and problems, and it actually really made 600 or 700 wheel. Then obviously all the drivetrains started breaking. Trans, all these BMW diesel trans breaking, R154s, V160s, all these transmissions that fit behind, or Tremex as well, obviously in competition drifting. Then they all started going to sequentials, and they're like, oh, well, let's get the cheapest sequential in the market, and then that fails. And then like, oh man, they were like already in like 2015 or something like that. Now they're all on like dog boxes and good sequentials. Not the cheapest sequential in the market, just a good sequential, which is like a 15 or 20 grand transmission. The smart people are on a 4-speed dog box, is like 6 or 7 grand, and it's like the best box you can get. And because that was the next step, then obviously quick changes, because they were like, oh man, I can do this with a standard super diff or BMW 210 diff, it never breaks. And then like, oh, it started breaking, you don't have the adjustable ratios, and then everybody was in the quick changes. Then we're like in 2017, 2018, where all the cars in these higher echelon drifting competitions had the motor, they had the motor figured out, they had the trans figured out, they had the rear end figured out. Then the shocks started coming, because a lot of people in 2018, 2019 were not running two-way shocks. They were just running the run-of-the-mill shocks, the normal shocks you could just click and buy, which is often just a race car shock. It's not even a road car or a drift car shock. So now you can see that that's what's happening right now. Like 2019 and up, guys in Europe are really figuring out the shocks and how to set up cars, how to work with Ackerman and like weight balance and jacking and all that stuff, because they were too occupied with the whole drivetrain and motor thing up until that point. So now cars it's not just the tire, it's also the suspension. Like guys are getting deals, like Jack Shanahan got a deal with a shock company. They're obviously gonna look into things and they're gonna develop a good shock for him, right? So now all of a sudden, those cars are at the point where the shock and the rear tire is going to be developed, and that it's not just the tire. There's a lot of people say like, oh, this tire should be banned, or that tire is too crazy. And sure, the Velino that Piotr had is an insane tire, because I drove them as well. And it's a crazy tire. Like, it makes my E46 Pro car feel like a 325i, literally. So yeah, I think that's a little too crazy for the like it's almost like a Cold War that's going on that's never going to end, and it needs to get maybe some kind of cap. And we need to look at something like how are we going to limit that, because like you can't be too crazy with the tire because it's just going to look stupid. You know, the cars are going to understeer and they're going to bobble. You know, it's just it turns into something else than drifting, right? Drifting is a show. It's two cars mimicking the angle, and like, but it needs to still have side bite. It needs to still, you know, look like drifting. So.
What's the drama behind the tire? Can you explain that in like 20 seconds?
The drama behind the tire?
Why do a lot of drivers want that tire gone in different series around the world?
Because I think that,
I think it got banned in D1.
Yeah, so drifting tires are it's always like an arms race, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the Nido tire now is a really good tire, right? But at one point it was not the best tire in FD. When Chelsea got to RTR, it was not the best tire in FD. There was a point where the Falcon wasn't the best tire in FD, and then they just constantly one up, and they develop a new tire, and then when Chelsea got to RTR, I think 1 season later or 2 seasons later, they got like the crazy tire that they're running right now, and then there's going to be another company and another company, and they're just constantly waiting on each other, or like have these development roadmaps that take a year or 2 years, and then they're like, oh, we're developing this new tire, and then next year the other tire, like Phi Tour, for instance, in Long Beach, or Rome was on the Phi Tour, a bunch of other guys, and they're all of a sudden, nobody had heard of a Phi Tour before, and all of a sudden this year in Long Beach, they were killing everybody with the tire. So it's like, there is no uniformity. You know, you just find out something, and all of a sudden this tire is killing everybody.
So the drama from tires is because they're too competitive against the older tires, or I kind of heard it as well that it was ripping the cars apart.
It is,
where the cars, the braking, like the teams didn't want to run. They wanted a less sticky tire.
Every team
so
wants
they
that,
wouldn't rip the cars apart so much, and it would lower the budget.
I think if you ask any FD or DMAC driver off the record, so nothing involving their tire deal or no politics involved, right? Because I can understand if you've been on a tire that's not the best tire for 2 or 3 seasons and you make do, and then your tire company comes out with a great tire, you're like, well, now it's my turn. You know, you're not going to say, oh, we should really get less sticky tires, because you've been basically, you know, running behind for 2 seasons, and now, I mean, I'm not going to name any brands, but that's like for sure, like some of the big names in drifting.
Call them out. Why not?
I don't think it's professional, but yeah. So there's a bunch of tires. There's a situation where a YouTuber put Driftmasters tires of brand A on his car, and he was driving against a professional DMAC driver. He was tandeming, or they were doing like a fun day or something on his DMAC tire, and he just smoked it. There was no way that DMAC car could keep up with this YouTuber's car. So, you know, that's
somebody I know?
Yeah, of course. So that's the thing, right? So some of these tires are so crazy, and it's not just the Foligno. It's like all these other brands have had iterations of their tire that at that time were the craziest tire. Like Tri-Ace with Dwayne McKeever was an insane tire at some point. And people are like, yeah, but it's illegal and this is that. Like, there's no durometers. Nobody tests this thread wear. So it says, like in the rule book, this and that thread wear, it says this and that rule, and nobody's actually checking that. So I don't think it's like easy to come up with those rules. But if you ask anybody off the record, take all their tire commitments and like sponsoring away from it, that every single pro driver in the world would want a less grippier tire, because the cars can be simplified. You may not even have to run nitrous, because nitrous is a lot of work. You need like 3 guys or 4 guys just for the nitrous.
You just got funneled into exactly what I was going to say, so keep going. Awesome. I'm just going to let you keep going.
Well, I mean, if you look at Chelsea's car at Irvindale, he's in this battle against Kristaps for the championship, right? And the nitrous fails. And it failed before because they had in, I think it was Washington, where it stuck and it sprayed this whole nitrous, the purge valve stuck or something, and the whole nitrous bottle went over the wind. I don't know if you remember that. Anyways, I remember that stuff because I always look at Chelsea stuff with like an eagle eye. And now they had a problem with the solenoid, which happens because it's a valve with 2 wires coming out. And you know how I feel about electronics. If it's an electric
You're
or
scared,
electronic.
I know.
I'm not scared. It's like if it's there, it will at one point fail. And in this case, I don't think RTR runs an old solenoid. It's probably a solenoid that's a couple months old at best. And it didn't work this time. They swapped in a different solenoid because that's such a professional team. They're ready to go. They have the solenoid ready to grab. they got Ray Shake, they got Dan, they got all these good guys, so they can do a solenoid swap in 5 minutes, no problem. And it still didn't work, right? He still didn't have nitrous. And then that car doesn't even drift anymore. So he comes off the bank, and it's like wavering. It's Chelsea Denofa, arguably the best driver in the world, in that Mustang that he helped develop, which has the gnarliest motor of any motor in FD by far. But it's so gripped up that it cannot drift on an 850, 900 horsepower NA Roush motor. It will not drift. It will
Probably only makes 550 or 600 foot-pounds of torque at the wheels.
Like it's,
NA.
I mean, come on,
Yeah.
like that's a nasty motor. It makes more torque than that, I'm pretty sure. I
bet
think
it doesn't.
No, I'm pretty sure it will.
Maybe it does. Anyways,
doesn't
what I was
matter.
going to say is...
So that car is
if you
super
could-
gripped up, right? That's the whole thing. It's crazy gripped up. It
if
needs
you
that
could
nitrous.
limit these cars from like, let's say I really like the point of like drivers would all want a more limited tire, simply because the cars could have less horsepower, less team power behind them, less people working on the cars. Their budgets would all go down. They could make more money in the end. You know, racing, the cars don't actually visually have to go faster because...
No, it probably looks way better.
Yeah.
Like looks
So that's
perspective.
kind of one of the things that you could change in drifting. If you could take a driver's budget, say they have 100 units of money, I guess you could say, and they had to run 6 or 7 rounds, and you added an 8th round in Canada, which they did a while back, the drivers freak out because they make less money. If you make the cars more competitive, you know, like the drivers potentially make less money because they have to build the car to a higher degree. So if you make them travel more, if you do whatever, you know, like you start to funnel the cars into braking more, the drivers and the teams have to travel more. Whatever it is, if you can pull back on some of these things, it lets like a lot of the teams be more profitable. How many teams do you think in Formula D are actually profitable?
Well, I think 2 to 4.
2 to 4?
Yeah.
So I was going to say the budgets are still important. It's not like F1 or something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
So it would allow the teams to focus on driving, not braking. If I wouldn't say let's limit them to like a 245 or anything, but if you did limit a car to a 245, they really realistically can only use 600 or 700 horsepower, and you wouldn't be braking diffs, transmissions, engines nearly as much. And you wouldn't. You'd still be consuming a ton of tires. And it doesn't fix the traveling budget though. So maybe it mostly fixes some workers and some consumables of the drivetrain. Maybe it's not
there's a
big
couple
help.
things going on, obviously, because it sounds amazing, right? And I agree with it, but there's more elements in the equation, right? So Formula Drift, as an organization, they work with tire suppliers, and these tire suppliers are big companies, right? And they have like huge factories where people work, and they have like layers of management and whatever, and FD is all about making these connections with these big brands and try to extend them into the future, right? So they don't want to be working with this company in 2023 and that company in 24. They want to build relationships, and that's why it's a profitable series. It's probably the only profitable drifting series in the world, and so you can't just send a memo to these guys like Nido, like, oh, make this, you know, like there's a whole process there. So you need to phase it in.
This is just
which
conceptual.
takes a while.
I'm not worried about phasing something
the
in over years.
conceptual thing has a lot to do with like the realistic thing that these guys have been spending all the money and research into making these crazy tires. And then, I mean, so it's not as like simple as like a switch that you turn.
It wouldn't be for the teams either. They'd have to rebuild cars.
Yeah, but like here's the other thing. So is it really going to solve anything? Because
I don't know.
I feel that there's still room for improvement in FD cars, and there's still room for improvement in Drift Masters cars, especially in the suspension side of things. Clients that I talk to that operate teams or that are drivers in either of these championships, there is still ways to go. Like I have to say, the learning curve is steep. So there's a lot of guys that 5 years ago had no idea about compression, rebound, slow bump, whatever. They had no idea. Now a lot of guys do, right? But there's still a whole bunch of teams out there that do not have that knowledge. And it's hard to find, because you could get a race car suspension guy. You could hire a guy, right? A 50-year-old guy that's worked in racing suspension his whole life, and you're hiring him for your Drift Masters team, which is unlikely. Because not a lot of guys are paid. You're not hiring professionals. They're just your friends, right? And a lot of these guys have shops They build things and they take their mechanics from their shop with them to Drift Masters. So it's not like Formula One where there's like a whole group of professionals, you know, that go from Alpine to Ferrari to Red Bull. Most of these teams are still based on friends and like people you know from, you know, that you grew up with, or one guy quit drifting but he still comes with you to events or whatever. So there's no wave of professionalism yet. So there's no real guys that are, there's maybe 4 or 5 guys in FD that work at the top teams that are really capable of moving or pushing the envelope in suspension development, and a lot of the other guys are just practicing you know, what they've learned. Like, all right, if we take a clicks off here and we do a couple you know, a couple millimeter toe in, then it does this and that. But most of these guys are just reactive. There's no, Chelsea is a guy that's like, he can come up with something by himself with a concept about suspension, and that's like completely out of the box, and like come up with something like, for instance, dynamic toe or bump steer. That's something that's relatively new, and a lot of people didn't understand it. Now everybody's talking about it, right? And this is something like the past 2-3 years. In 2017, 2018, you heard nobody about dynamic toe in and all that stuff.
It just means as the car goes down in the back, it toes in.
But there's a lot of like, that's a huge subject in itself, because what's happening, obviously, you have your weight transfer, but you also have your anti-squat that's working against that, right? So you need to almost like reduce your anti-squat. So what you're seeing is that 2017, 2018, we're like, oh, higher anti-squat percentage is better. Well, it gives you more forward, but like on some cars, you actually don't want more forward. Like on an S chassis, and on an E90, you do want more forward. So if somebody rides on the floor, my car does a lot better with less Ackerman, that doesn't mean that works for your, because you may have a whole different tire, you may have a whole different, even S13, S14 is different, because the wheelbase is different. And the rear subframe of an S13 is different than an S14 in the anti-squat department. So what you're seeing right now is that guys are reducing anti-squat in a car so they have more dynamic toe, you know, but that will take out some forward bite. And also, like, how does it relate to your tire? Like, if you look at Odie, those are like huge, there's like almost like drag racing tires. So what works for his car, so people look at Odie's, I did a video on Odie's car, right? On my channel, I think it's a year and a half ago. I went to his shop. He just had the new shop at his house. Obviously, Odie and me, I work with him. He sponsors me. We became friends throughout my visits in California. And when I made that video of that car, a lot of people were copying that. They were like, oh, he changed that. He reduced the anti-squat. But like that, he did that on a 1,000 horsepower FD car with 3-way suspension, which maybe 1% of the people who work in drifting can actually set up 3-way suspension. 2-way is already hard enough. So he can make that car fly. Look at Simon Olsen and look at Odie's cars, which are the oldest chassis probably in the top 5, which are not factory back teams. And they're like, Simon Olsen could have become a champion with Odie's car. Ben Hobson won Pro Spec with Odie's car. Odie was second in FD, and they're S chassis. It's not an A90. It's not like they're old cars, right? So he knows what he's doing, obviously. There's no other way. There's no way you can say, Odie doesn't know what he's doing. He's sticking it to the man with an old car.
All right.
Right?
I love it. He's like a wind-up toy. I just give him a subject, and he goes, clean subject.
That's
Ready?
what you want.
No, it's great. He's doing great. All right.
I even lost
You're
the point.
You're a good talker. I know. I have to cut you off a little bit so I can put you on a new subject so you can roll again.
So we're not doing like a conclusion
Next
on the
one?
tires?
No, the conclusion would take 30 minutes.
Awesome.
You weren't getting to a conclusion.
So the conclusion is
I think
this.
I told you 30 seconds.
Here's the conclusion.
How does he keep like
Here's the conclusion.
Time?
Here's the conclusion.
Go ahead.
So let's say we go to a 200 threat, we're 265 in Formula Drift and Drift Masters, and we're actually enforcing that. So there's a guy with a durometer, which is never going to happen, but for obvious reasons. But there's a guy with a durometer that's checking all these tires, and you know, obviously now they check the sizes, right? You can't get away with the tire that's too wide. Let's say we do that. Then people think, yeah, but then the average Joe can compete in FD. You don't need like a crazy axles. You don't need to swap out axles every season, and you can run like a second-hand dog box instead of a new dog box. And the average Joe can start winning, right? It's not the case, because the good teams, the top teams, they will find the other difference, which is, for instance, in shocks.
It wasn't about making the teams competitive and like even or all this stuff. It was simply letting the teams be more profitable and allow them to stay within the sport longer and have smaller teams and more focused?
Well, is it going to be that? Because it's what's probably going to happen is that
I don't know. I'm not a professional.
They're probably going to develop other areas like the
Yeah,
shops.
they're supposed to.
Yeah, but then it's still
The
still
teams
going
with
to
$1
be
million
fast.
are going to still spend $1 million, but you can allow the other teams to be there. Is what I'm saying.
They can be there, but
Yeah.
they're just not going to get beat by the tires.
That's
gonna
all they're
get beat
ever
by
there
something
is.
else.
Yeah, they're always
Yeah.
going to get beat, but at least they exist. All right, next
Awesome.
subject. All right, Wout is from Amsterdam. He's European. He hates everything European. He loves America. He's wearing a Buc-ee's sweatshirt.
Represent.
So he's not the perfect person to ask this, but maybe you see people around you. Drift Masters is probably the fastest growing international, or the fastest growing series around the world, whether if it's on top or not, and all these things about Formula D. I'm not asking that question, but they clearly threw the biggest drift event in the world, I think. Is that up for question? Probably the biggest drifting event in the world.
I saw one person question it because he said there had been one event that had more attendance.
It doesn't matter. It
But
was
like
very
it doesn't
large.
matter. It
Doesn't
was
matter.
insanely impressive.
But
and
my point
crazy.
is, are the Europeans finally going to take off? Are the Europeans super proud of this? I know there's not as many drifters in Europe and all this stuff, but I'm saying at the professional level and as a show and everything else, they seem poised to grow faster and more, and they're more motivated to grow. Why is that?
Compared to who?
D1, or like Formula D, whoever else, King of Nations, Russian Drift Series.
I would not agree that like drifting is more popular in Europe.
Oh, I'm not saying it's more popular.
America.
I'm saying that they're on an upward trajectory of changing the way
probably
they do
because
things
they
more.
come from way
See,
back.
he hates it so much
I don't
he can't
hate
even
it.
support his own thing.
Do you want the answer?
Yeah,
no?
go.
Why do you think I'm here in America?
Because you want to argue with me on camera.
Exactly.
You volunteered for
Here's
this.
the thing.
Fucking talk.
Here's the thing. Oh, you guys should comment because there's a lot of these that Aaron hasn't posted yet, like at least 4 that we recorded that Aaron hasn't posted. So
Side formatted the cards.
please comment that he has to air them because they're
keep
really
going.
good. So here's the thing, right? And people say, yeah, wow, you always hate Europe and this and that. I wasn't born hating Europe. I was born loving Europe. I loved it. I was pretty dumb as a kid, I have to say. For instance, I thought that Jesus spoke Dutch, because at the elementary school they had like Bible hour, and they had like, and Jesus said this and that, and it was in Dutch, right? Because I'm Dutch, and I was like, wow. So Brazil is the best football nation in the world. America is like all the military and all the Hollywood movies and all the music, but the Netherlands has Jesus. Because I actually thought that Jesus was Dutch because he spoke Dutch, right? And it wasn't until I was like 6 or 7. So that's how dumb I was as a kid. Probably I'm still pretty dumb right now. So I didn't grow up like hating Europe and all that stuff. But like at one point, if you start comparing your own situation to another situation,
He made this all about him. The question was...
this is just me introducing the subject, right? So here's the thing. You want me to talk, and then when I talk,
We do. You've got to be a little bit briefer.
Right, and make more episodes. So here's the podcast. I drove 36 hours. Like I love one podcast. I fucking hate fucking 15-minute podcasts because I got to scroll through and find a new episode and crash into people. Anyways, so the reason why I like America and my Dutch friends, Lars and Niels, who came over and drive our Corvette C5, or Richard Advani's Corvette C5 right now, is because you can never do this in Europe. No country in Europe can you do this. You can do it with like 1 or 2 cars, like one day. But like you can't do this, like organize all these cars and all these like tire changing and whatever. It's just not possible. So Drift Masters is amazing. It's huge. David Egan is a genius. He's the godfather of European drifting. He literally took it from nothing to an insane sport that's like backed by Red Bull. That's the production value is crazy. If you look at the behind the scenes, I think David Egan posted a picture of a barrier which had like a barcode on it and like a whole thing, you know. It's just so, and then it dawned on me, like this is so professional compared to what it was before, right? So they've done something incredible, right? But that's like, I think Drift Masters is probably 60 to 70% of European drifting. FD is 1% of American drifting. And that's the difference. So Americans see Drift Masters and they see Lauri Heinonen, who's an up-and-coming Finnish driver. That's awesome showman. He has a NASCAR S13. You have the Shanahans, who are, especially Connor, really cool on camera. Like you grab him, he comes out of the car, he has a good story, and he's like, yeah, isn't that the power steering failed? We kept going, and like They have an amazing crew. They have the John Shanahan, their dad. Like they're all like really cool people that look really, you know, you just want to like them, you know, because they're just, and they're so good. Those Shanahan kids are so ridiculously good. It's just Connor's car not working. They had a problem with the crank. They swap in a crank or they swap the motor. That's what I understood from one of their mechanics.
I'm
and
not
then
saying one is better than the other. You know? I was talking about the upward trajectory of the series and things like that.
So people see that and they think that all Europeans are like that and that they all come from a vast pool of like European Lone Star Drift, you know, and European English Town and European Sonoma, that all that stuff funnels like all these guys, but that's not true. Because there is no Grassroots to speak of in Europe. It does not exist. There is no Drift Week. There is no Lone Star Drift. It's all not there, you know? And that's what people really forget because they see that like, oh, European drifting is so much better. Well, DMAC is amazing, but like everything else, like there's the Nürburgring Drift Cup, which is amazing, right? I spoke about it a couple times. So like these are like small things. They like 4 events per year. And the guy that organized it loses a bunch of money on it. He does it out of the goodness of his heart. He's an event organizer for track days and racing. He's an ex-racer himself, amazing guy. And he just organizes this drifting competition out of the goodness of his heart, you know, but he's not making any money. And in America, there's viable organizations, like you are probably the longest standing drift organizer in the world. Probably.
No, there's a bunch.
Yeah, but like, where are they?
Abu, I think, said he was been doing it for 20 years. Brian Eggert.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of people.
Brian Eggert is American. You're an American. So US Drift is how old? 2 decades?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're 2 decades? Yeah. So there's nothing like that in Europe. It doesn't exist. So Britain, England, doesn't even have a drift series right now.
It killed, dead. But I don't even remember my own question.
So
now.
your question
Upward
is that like,
trajectory.
so I feel like what happens now that drifting in Europe and David Egan and his team and all these guys like Mr. Dudko and all these guys that are working really hard to make all that happen, they are doing what I always dreamt of, which is drawing crowds in that are not drifters and that are not family of drifters. You know, the crowds, like we spoke about this before, the people that go to monster truck things.
Yeah, they don't own monster
trucks. They go to
trucks.
tractor pulling, you know, they don't care, they just want something cool. Because that is a vast audience. If you're, and before drifting was like, it was your mom, your dad, the guy from work that you show the video drifting and they show up, you know, and blah, blah, blah. David Egan is working towards getting that audience that has no direct link to drifting. They just like rallying, they like Monster Jam, they like boxing, they like MMA fighting, you know, they like tractor pulling, and that's what you want because that's hundreds and thousands of people. So that's really smart about Drift Masters that they're gearing towards that. But they are the exception that confirms the rule. And like I said, there is no real grassroots. Like in Ireland, of course, they have a strong drifting scene. But like in the rest of Europe, it really doesn't exist to speak of in any volume. So what I do feel like, to answer your question, is that in Europe, there's this influx of people that are not drifters and that are not related to drifting that now start to pay attention to drifting. But I'll say this, in America, because I've been all over America, this is my 5th time driving cross country in 3 years. If I have my car with me at a gas station, Americans will come up to me and they say, oh, that's a drift car, right? They don't say, it's a race car, it's a time attack car, it's a sports car, it's a Fast and Furious car. No, they say a drift car. That does not happen in Europe. You can go on an enclosed with like all kinds of drift or like with a drifting car sticker on or whatever, and people have no idea what it is. If you're at a gas station with an open trailer with a pro drift car on it, they think it's a race car or drag racing, you know. So the general public does not know what it is. Well, here I walk into an AutoZone or what's the other one, O'Reilly's, and there's Dylan Hughes. There's Adam LZ, there's Chelsea in an AutoZone, right? So these guys over here are like, if I go to Europe and I go to a parts store, there's no Jack Shannon or James Dean. If I ask, so I did it. I had a friend of mine, Ron from England, he visited me in Amsterdam, amazing guy. And we were talking about this subject as well. And Ron Lawton, super cool guy. If you're listening, shout out, come back to Amsterdam, we can chill. And we were sitting in Amsterdam in the dead city center in this super busy bar. And we were talking about drifting and like how the sport was going and whatever. And it was like nobody's ever heard of James Dean in this bar, you know? and he is the best drifter, won the most things, no drama. He's like great with sponsorship. He's the guy, you know, that has did everything right. And nobody's heard of him in Europe except like insiders. It's because I asked people in that bar, like, hey, do you know James Dean? And they obviously they know the movie star James Dean. Like, no, I don't need a movie star, you know. So they've never heard of these people. Where in America, people have heard of LZ, maybe not for FD, but they've heard of LZ, and he's a drifter. LZ is a drifter. He has a bunch of drift cars. He started drifting with an S13. So he's a big figure. Chelsea, like people know who Chelsea is, people know who Vaughn is. Like if you go to a gas station, there's this huge Monster Energy thing with Vaughn on it. Like in every state, I've seen them, right? That does not exist in Europe. There's no posters with Jack Shannon or Laurie Heinonen or James or any of these guys out there, right?
And yet they have the highest attendance drift event in the
Yeah,
world.
so I mean, but like there's obviously factors that determine that. I think Poland is always been very strong in drifting. They've always had an insanely strong drifting competition, was always considered the hardest competition in the world. That's why James went there, because that's how James and Piotr met. He had his yellow Skyline and James had his S14, and that's how they met. Because at one point, Piotr was the only guy who could beat James. And the Polish guys were like, you know, that battle with James with the blue S14, you know, when they were like dooring him in that stadium and whatever. So the Polish were like the only guys that could beat the Irish at some point. So Ireland and Poland have super strong drifting communities, but like there's 30 other countries in Europe that don't have that. If you look at Spain or Italy, Italy is an amazing country, has like huge car industry. There's no drifting to speak. Obviously, they have events and shit, but there's no Italian James Dean, right? There's no
Frederick is like
there's
Federico.
good Italian drivers, right? Scarifo, right? Yeah.
Yeah, tear down his cheek while you say
Yeah.
that.
Oh, yeah. Well, sorry, Federico. Federico. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I call him Frederick.
Yeah, you keep calling him Frederick, but you're the worst with names. You're the worst. Anyways, so I'm thinking, yeah, I don't want to take anything away from Drift Masters. Awesome event. I actually, like, I got emotional seeing that picture that Dave posted of that barrier, because I'm like, this looks like a Formula One event. This looks like a super professional event, and they've done it. They've pulled it off, right? But on the other hand, like I see over here, I see how strong the actual normal population appreciates drifting and knows about drifting. So then I'm saying like, yeah, you know, there's ways to go in Europe. And you're seeing like the countries that have really strong drift communities, but like there's a lot of them that are lacking, obviously. You know, Frederick Osbo goes to FD.
There's a lot of
Olsen
states in the United States that have no drifting whatsoever.
Yeah, but it's one country.
Just existed.
Yeah,
I know, but Europe is basically one big country.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
No, it's a continent.
Okay. All right,
But
next
anyways,
question.
next
Next question. This next question, Wout has been waiting for his entire life. I really should make this an entire episode on its own.
How many minutes are we now?
All right. I might cut this and make this its own new episode. Or maybe, we'll see.
Should we do a new intro then? Hello, friends.
No, we'll keep rolling for right now.
Okay.
What is the most likely part on a drift car to kill someone during drift week? Besides the driver. Besides the driver.
A fatal accident.
What's the most likely thing to kill someone on drift week?
So a part that fails and kills somebody, that's what you're saying. I would say probably suspension or a fire. So like a fuel line or exhaust wrap or something like that.
I would say the thing that is almost done it the most times is angle kits.
Yeah, for sure.
And we're not going to name any names or do anything like that. But I would like for you to explain to me why angle kits on drift cars on the street and on the track are so dangerous.
Yeah.
I could say something about it, but instead we have Wout here, and I'll just let him talk. Why are they so dangerous, and why do they fail constantly? Because we see them fail constantly.
Well, I'd have like this is. I don't know if I'm like the most credible person to say that, because everybody knows how.
That's why we're not going to mention brands. But like, you're smart. Hey, you weren't allowed to say that word.
Well, I get
my
car is done 40,000 miles.
I get it, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about angle kits in general.
Yeah, no, there is no angle kits in general.
Everybody watching this knows what you drive on.
Exactly, and that's probably the only kit that has done this many drift weeks without failure.
That's fine.
So there's something there, and I feel like I always say to people, because people say, you're just a Y-Sub guy. You just don't Y-Sub, Y-Sub, Y-Sub.
There was no mention of brands.
No, listen. Here's
this
the
whole
thing.
thing.
It doesn't matter.
You wouldn't let me do it.
Listen, you can't. Otherwise, I'd have to say brand A the whole time, and people would
that's
still
fine.
know it. Anyways, if you glue a piece of glass on a piece of aluminum, you don't have an iPhone, right? It looks like an iPhone. It looks like a movie prop iPhone, but it's not an iPhone.
Okay, I wasn't trying to get brand specific though. I'm going to argue with you on this, and I'm going to get in here.
Hold up.
We're going to chop this up.
Here's the thing.
Not letting you do this to me.
I don't care. So people, people don't understand what the difference is between a good and a bad angle kit. And I understand
we're
that
talking
they don't
about
know that.
in general. I was going to say, you're steering a car down the highway and a part fails, whether it be a poor Heim that from China, whatever we're talking about.
Yeah.
You have steering on your car, and it's important. And our rear arms don't break like this. The failure of rear arms on a car is much, much lower than front arms, correct?
Yeah.
On these trips.
So. Well, a lot
and
of
we
people
see sometimes a design failure, sometimes a material failure.
Yeah.
All these parts are heavily abused.
Yeah.
I mean, like these dudes are at Adam's Kart Track, they're driving up a berm constantly. They're hitting stuff. They're hitting curb things. It's not all on the fault of the angle kits. It's also on the driving and the abuse and the way we're driving these things.
Well, the forces are immense because it's leverage, right? So if you have like a wrench and you can't get something off and you make the wrench 5 inches longer, all of a sudden you do break it loose. If you look at an angle kit, a pro angle kit for an average chassis extends the lower control arm by probably between 3 and 5 inches depending on the chassis, right? So a Corvette is going to be a lot different than
5 inches on a lower control arm?
Yes. Oh, well, that's like extreme, but like let's say
I don't know how big 5 inches is.
Let's say 2 to 4 inches, right? Yeah, you don't know. You're just in the 3.5 inch. So anyways, so let's say 3 inches, right? On average, you could calculate the increase of force that exerts on the subframe and on all these joints and whatever. Apart from that, you're also putting the wheels at angle, which gives them more resistance. And they're putting more resistance on that already extended arm.
Now we're getting somewhere. You're giving good answers now.
So
keep going.
Don't interrupt me then.
Right?
Good. If you want these kind of answers, you stop interrupting me, because otherwise I'll give bullshit.
I'm encouraging you.
The listeners are going to know, because I'm going to do like a secret handshake, and they're going to know if it's a bullshit answer to teach you a lesson. Anyways, so that's a theory, right? If there angle kit companies like YSFAB calculate the force that is being put on these joints, right? Because you can calculate that, right? They're engineers. And that's insane. Like, you wouldn't believe how. So let's say BMW E46, E36, you know that chassis mount that people call a lollipop, right? How much force in pounds do you think goes on there if you're driving a track like this?
I would think if you're braking, you have the full force of the car. A car can probably generate like a G on normal tires. So what's a G? 3,000 pounds of force divided by 2 because front, but sometimes all the weight's on one. You have at least 3,000 pounds of force, probably something like that through that lollipop.
That's correct.
If you're hitting a bump at the same time and you have slicks on, I would think that you could probably double that at least.
Yeah.
So I would think that if you hit a bump, am I in the ballpark? 6,000 pounds plus.
So imagine,
and if you hit something, I mean, you could hit 50,000 pounds of force.
So that's basically a 1995 Suburban hanging on that joint. And if you look at a lot of these angle kits, I'm like, is a 1995 Suburban gonna hang on that joint? Probably not, you know? And that's the whole thing. So the thing that's very difficult to copy on angle kits is the materials and the way they're being heat treated and the way that they're being manufactured. And it goes all the way down to the chain of supply, like which manufacturers do you work with? Can you trust these manufacturers, these suppliers of steel? Because like if you buy steel in Germany, we make like transmission mounts and motor mounts and all these kinds of things with my own brand, Einzel. And we get our steel from Germany, and there's a material certificate with all this steel. And we have a certain specification, so we say like, all right, we want a 235 plus C tube that's 40 mil, right? 40 millimeters and a 2 millimeter wall thickness. And I tell them it needs to be at least 350 Newton per square millimeter, which is average for like a FIA roll cage tubing. Then I'll get a material certificate from this German company with that bundle of tubes that they bring to us. And it says, for instance, 404 Newton or 398 or 421, right? And I've been doing this for January, and come January, I'll have my company for 21 years. So we've been doing this for a while, and I've seen a bunch of material certificates in my life. There's people that get stuff from cheaper suppliers, usually not Europe, or they work with like an agent that's in between that imports it from other countries. And I've seen those material certificates, and they are, for instance, exactly 350. That's bullshit, right? If I request a tube that's 350 Newton, I've never seen a material certificate that says 350 Newton. That means that they're bullshitting you. That means that they're looking at your email. Oh, it has to be 350? Oh, 350. There is no way. And people who are working in that industry, they know that, right? Because what happens is they make 100 feet of that tubing, and then they cut off 3 feet, and that gets tested. And then that tubing, that 97 feet, gets certified with that little piece, right? So they measure the tensile strength and all that stuff. And that's what people really don't understand, because that should make products fail or not fail. And there's also obviously heat treating, right? So you're doing things, there's processes that you do to the steel, but you cannot copy that. So you can buy an angle kit, you can look at it, you can 3D scan it, because there's like guys that have a little van that come by to your house and they'll scan that table for $100 and you'll get a digital file from the table. They just drive around with like a scanner, right? There's a lot of these guys do it. Cage Kids comes to people, to a shop, like let's say Ryan Turk is building some crazy car. Cage Kids sends a guy there and they scan that crazy car. There's only one of them in the world, and they make a kit for Ryan Turk, right? Okay. So it's very, very easy to scan a shape these days. But the shape, like I said before, this is like gluing a piece of aluminum to a piece of glass and thinking you have an iPhone, because you know 5% of the product, which is what it looks like, which really isn't that difficult. Because if you were inclined to copy things, you just buy the kit, like an angle kit's like between $1,600 and $2,200. If you're starting a $5 million operation, you could buy that kit. I mean, that's what Mitsubishi buys Nissans and Opels and reverse manufactures them, right? That's how it works. So obviously it's theft and it's morally not good, and you're not the kind of person that I feel is growing the sport, but you could do that. However, it's not going to get you anywhere, because you don't know the materials, you don't know the process behind it, and that's even more important, right? So the geometry and everything, and like your scrub and all that stuff, that relates to how the angle kit feels, and in a way to how much force goes everywhere, right? But that doesn't really relate to the quality of the kit. It's just the production process, your suppliers, the way you treat your materials, the way you weld them, even like the order of how you weld them. It makes a huge difference. Your quality control, stress testing, all these things. And that's why some angle kits fail and some angle kits don't fail, although they look exactly the same to the average Joe, right? Because the average Joe thinks like, oh, brand A, they've won FD 3 times in a row with James Dean. They won FD 2 times in a row with Ferric Osbo. They've won the European Championship 25 times. The entire top 16 Drift Masters Championship standings is on brand A. But I look at this other brand, and it's cool. I can get this in green and gold, and you know, that's how they look at things. Like, I like the gold.
I see how he's sneaking stuff in by using colors instead of brand names.
No, I'm just saying how people make decisions, right?
Yeah,
if I make a decision, I'd like to think of myself, I build drift cars, I operate a team, so I have a different way of purchasing things, than the average Joe that's like, oh man, I went to this drifting event and my nephew drifts and loans to drift with Aaron with a Z, and I just bought this Z. Would you believe it? I got a Z for $5,000. Let's put an angle kit on it. Like, they have a different thought process in purchasing something, than me, because they do something completely different with their car. They may even laugh about it if the wheel falls off on the highway. We can't have that. Like, I'm here in Drift Week, I can't have wheels falling off cars. But somebody else is like, maybe if I would do ice hockey, I would laugh about getting a stupid stick, and I'm like, oh, I'll get this stick, brand B, and it snaps in half, and I would laugh about it. Oh man, my stick broke, so silly, because ice hockey for me is like a little joke, right? But like Wayne Gretzky making a shot for the World Cup, he does not want that fucking stick to break. right? And that's the difference. And that's why a lot of these companies exist. Because people, I had a friend that buys brand new cars, depending on the fact if she can get it in bright red or not. That's her requirement. So she wants a bright red, like red, like this hat of this beaver, even worse, like fire truck red. And then BMW doesn't have that color, and then she just buys a Subaru, which is great, but like that's a different process.
You mentioned lengthening the control arm 5 inches, putting a lot more stress on it that way, putting different tires on it, all these different things. Why are lengthened control arms with some redneck in his shop who just cuts a control arm, boxes it, extends it however much, and then cuts a knuckle, which is a cast iron knuckle. Are they cast iron? Cast steel. Sorry, cast steel. And everybody's like, oh, you have to preheat it, weld it this way, everything else. Nobody does that properly. They just weld these knuckles up. Why are those so reliable?
Because in a way, you're tapping into a knuckle. So we have a kit that's like relies on cutting a BMW 36 knuckle and you weld.
Oh, he got it back to himself.
I'm just explaining it. Because there's nothing wrong with that stock control arm. Like there's obviously Chinese ones that are $30 and there's like Milo ones that are $80, and that's a bandwidth in itself. But that's made in a huge factory with probably also tensile stress and shit, because like they can get sued, right? So everything that's made for a road car. But it's also old, right? So you have an E36 knuckle is made in 1991. I mean, there's guys on this trip that are born after 1991. And you're welding that thing. And that may very well be a knuckle that will stay on the car for 100 years. I mean, I have a 1953 car, a Chevrolet, 1953 Chevrolet, and all the suspension on that is still 1953. So I guess that works, right? I'm not doing FD with it. Maybe an FD.
So it's just over-engineered enough that if you modify it,
it's made by BMW, which is a very good manufacturer, or Toyota, or Nissan.
So you're relying on
you're tapping
real
in, but
engineers.
you're also kind of like changing, the application, and you're welding on it. And it's like you say, like I welded knuckles for E36s, obviously, like everybody in Europe has done, and we would do that. We would get these NASA blankets, is what I would call them, and I would heat up that knuckle. It was glowing red, and then we would weld it like a chamfered piece, and then I would wrap it in this NASA blanket and put it under the workbench, and like 2 days later it was still like lukewarm, right? Even in winter. And that's like the molecules that you're dispersing all over the place by welding it. The slower they go back into place, the better it is. That's why if you weld something, you put it under cold water, it becomes brittle, because those molecules are forced into all kinds of configurations that are not strong. But now we're back at this metallurgy process that's extremely important, and that's where your strength comes from. Because I agree, you could grab an E36 knuckle, you could cut it, you could weld it. If you weld it hot enough, you probably don't even have to preheat it or post-heat it. But are you going to go on this track, which is fourth gear? It's a lot of force on that car. If you would weld it and then hold it under cold water until it's cooled off, and then put it on the car, would you like that? Like, I wouldn't really feel comfortable with that. So the point is, you don't really know what you're doing, and the fact that it works for a lot of people. There's guys that won championships all over Europe with cut knuckles. In Japan, a lot of guys are still on cut knuckles. They're relying on Toyota or Nissan knuckles, and they made a change to it, which is only one change. So the 99 other aspects of the knuckle are still in place, which are probably pretty good. But it's also still a lottery, right? You're still like gambling on it. Also, those kits don't really have the performance of a professional angle kit when it comes to side bite. And all this, they just can't do the same thing. Just because the wheel can go to 60 degrees does not mean it's the same performance as a professional FD or DMAC kit that can go to 60 degrees, because they don't do the same things. So they can never have the same force. And it stands to reason that a person who is into the knuckle cutting arm business is not very likely that they have a 1,000 horsepower motor and a super sticky front tire, right? So they would be a journeyman drifter with an SR20 stock turbo, or a 325i or a 328, and they just cut those things and they run like a Ling Long 225 front tire, and they drive Apple Valley, which is an amazing track, but it's not exactly Hallett or this track, right? So what are those guys really doing? Like, show me a person that grabs like FD style, that grab like the front wheels that Chelsea has in his Mustang, and has a 900 horsepower gripped up car that slings it at a bank with, you know, the force and the speed that those guys do, and the frequency that those guys do it with cut knuckles. I mean, they may very well split in half, and the fucking car may end up in a crowd.
I've almost never seen a cut knuckle split in half.
I've
It's
never
pretty
seen,
darn rare. I've seen a lot of
guys
normal
crash
angles.
really hard with crushed knuckles, and the knuckle is fine. So
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's unsafe. I'm just saying, like, you're doing one thing, and I don't want to give away the farm about drifting geometry, drift suspension geometry, obviously, because, you know, that's how it works. But they just simply cannot do what a professional angle kit can do, you know, so it's not about just angle. There's so many elements in that equation.
Do people install them incorrectly? And are they the problem? Because we know that somebody could use the wrong metals, someone could abuse them.
I think...
Do you see a lot of failures that? We were talking about people over-torquing things.
Over-torquing is a thing, obviously. Like, I think we talked about that, was it with you? I was speaking with somebody today. So people do nut and bolt checks, right? Which is good. Nut and bolt checks are super important because they're all fixed joints, right? There's no less movement in there. And I have to say, in my car, like, they never come off, but how do you nut and bolt check something, right? So again, it goes down to the details.
Mark.
No. Right, yeah, that's how you do it. But how do people do this, right? So they're doing Drift Week, they're doing a bunch of laps, they're doing Lone Star Drift. Your competitions are fast-paced. Like, I couldn't believe how fast that went. Like, I feel like I couldn't even leave the car when I was in your competition. I was like, I have to stay in the car.
That's my goal, is to be the fastest.
No, you are. It's
Earth.
awesome. It was awesome. But like in Europe, you do a battle, you roll back to the paddock. You can almost take off your overalls if it's warm, you know. That's, and on your competition, I was like, geez, I didn't even know what's going on. I didn't even know if I was in 16 or 8 or 4. I had no idea. I just rolled off the track with the other guy, and who was there? This kid.
John Yim.
And he was like pointing to you or not, and I rolled on, and I got like guys like Jimmy Bruce and these guys are watching, like, yeah, well, let's go. And I was like, all right, I'll go back, you know, and I had no idea. It was like, am I winning? Am I in the final yet, or where am I, you know? Because it was, and I like that, you know, because you stay in the groove, and the competition. I enjoyed that day so much, by the way. That was awesome.
Good.
One of the best drifting competitions I've ever done. And it was nice beating like guys like Jake Wise and all those guys on the
I like how you threw that in.
I mean, that was, yeah, that's awesome. Jake Wise scratched my door, so hey, Jake. No, Jake is an awesome guy, and it felt honored to drive with those Texas guys, because I feel that the Texas competition is one of the strongest in America, maybe in the world, because of what you do. No, it is. Like,
The strongest in the world.
it's hard. No, listen, who comes to Texas and cleans out, like, to like the Lone Star Drift events? Like, it's hard.
No, it's tough.
Yeah. So these guys, because you're all about seat time, right?
Yeah.
So here's the thing. Let's stay on topic. So your competitions are fast-paced, right? Your competitions are fast-paced. You don't have ages that put the car on jack stands, look under it, have your, like in FD, we do something, the car comes back to the pit, we jack it up, we put it in jack stands. I've got Nate, my crew chief, he has memorized this list, you know, we check these, some things we don't check after every run, some things we do, and there's this whole motions that we go through, and we take the wheels off and all that stuff. But on Drift Week, you don't always do that, and people are not in bolt check, and they leave the wheels on, they leave the car on the ground, and the torque wrench cannot go between the wheel and the bolt, right, for instance. So they just grab a normal wrench, and the normal wrench has no torque rating, so they're just like pulling it, like, all right, that's good, right?
Neither do my other wrenches.
Well, so if we provide a kit, it says the torque specs on everything. So M12 bolt is, for instance, 90 Newton meters. Let's just say something, right? So you grab a torque wrench, you put it in 90 Newton meters or 58 foot-pounds, whatever the fuck it is, and it clicks. And like, you should actually have that torque wrench checked every year, because otherwise you still have no idea. Nobody does that. But
do I take them back to Harbor Freight?
I got a new one from America. The little Chinese kid's gonna fix it. No, I got like the ones I use to build motors at my shop. The company that sells them sends somebody over
to check them.
No, he just picks them up, because the area where I'm at, there's a lot of these shops, right? Because I'm close to the airport. There's a lot of these car industry and like stuff, engine builders. And the company that I buy my torque wrenches from for motor building, because those are obviously quite expensive, they will come by and they'll grab it, give me a loaner, And after 3 days, they'll drop it off, and it's like certified for the year again. Because on a motor, like 2 Newton meters makes a difference, right? Because you're crushing things, crush fit or like preload. People obviously don't do that with their drift week torque wrench, because I think 99% of the people don't even have a torque wrench. They don't even torque their wheels, right? So what they do is they grab a normal wrench and they just pull it. But what happens is that you're constantly pulling it a little further, so that bolt that wasn't 58 foot-pounds, every time you nut and bolt check, it's like another foot-pound extra, right? Because your hand doesn't do the click. It's just you move it tighter every time you're nut and bolt checking. And then you can fail things, because at one point it's going to end up at 70 foot-pounds, which is not good, and you can stretch the bolt or you can do whatever, you know? So what you should technically do is pull the wheels off and use your actual torque wrench that you had verified every year. But like, we can't force people to do that, but that's how angle kits work, because they need to have beefy joints, right? They need to have sphericals. They can't use like the plastic line or cheap ball joints that a normal car has, because if you do one drift week, you'll need to replace them all. With that, obviously, this torque spec comes to play, right? And that's one of those things. And I think if you have a really good quality spherical, it's less sensitive to that. So I feel like you could be really careless with our stuff and it will still work. Because like Brian Page Howell, well, you know me, right? You see me prepping my car and nut and bolt checking my car, and I'm kind of a particular person about that. But Brian Page Howell or Jordan are not. And that's why I want to work with them. And that's why, for instance, Brian Page Howell, for me, is very important on angle kits, because he's the average guy. He's this SoCal guy. He just wants to drive. He doesn't want to he doesn't clean shit. He doesn't torque check shit. He has 2 tools with him. He's just like, I just want to drive, you know, and he makes it work. And he's an awesome driver because of that. But like, he's the kind of guy that I want to work with, because if it works with him, you know, then it's going to work. Same with Jordan. Jordan has such a heavy foot, it's ridiculous. He has no fear. His cars are always fast and heavy, and he drives like a complete, you know, reckless person, I would almost say. But our stuff doesn't fail. You remember he was on Drift Week 3, he had a different brand of angle kit. He could do 1 lap and something would fail.
That was pretty funny.
Yeah, so everything on the angle kit
I think it
failed.
was a custom kit too that they made for him,
Yeah,
that
it
was
doesn't
modified.
matter, but like,
You just said something about weight. Is like a Miata kit use all the same joints, or like, you know, a lightweight car kit use the same joints as like an F80 kit? Or do they scale everything
what's going
down?
on with all these animals over here?
He's coming to say hi.
Hey, what's up, bro? Anyways, you guys can tell there's like critters on the floor here. Although it's an amazing facility, by the way. It's beautiful. But there's a critter. Anyways, so Jordan, like, that's the kind of person I like to work with, because he's, I wouldn't say careless, but he's also not exactly Papadakis with the way he builds things. It can be a little crude with suspension stuff. And he's certainly crude with how he drives and how he, you know, on Drift Week, he's a hard worker, right? If his car fails, he's got it up and running in like a couple of minutes. Yeah, so he knows what he's doing. But he's not like a meticulous guy that's like checking everything. And like, you know, Chris Finch's mechanic is doing everything. Like Zach, he's torque wrenching everything. And if he does like, he replaces Chris's axle on Drift Week, he grabs a torque wrench and he torques the bolts of the, Jordan doesn't do that. He's like, all right, boom, yeah, all right, bro, it's fine, you know. And for me, those guys are important, because that's like the kind of client that I also would like to cater to, because I don't want to work with just TFD teams that double check everything. I want to work with guys like Brian and Jordan, who are average guys, who are not like constantly checking their stuff. And if it works for them, I feel then it's a really good product, right? So I think that's like proof of concept, and that's probably even more important than winning FD or than winning Drift Masters, because it's obviously awesome to have these victories in these great competitions that have really strong teams competing in them. But like, to me, the grassroots people and the Drift Week kind of people, they're equally important, because it's probably even worse for them if something fails. Like, let's say if Osbo has a failure. All right, sucks, right? And he just, it's part of it. They're like, they're on an interview with the FD people, and they're like, oh, Frederick, it sucks, something broke. Your gearbox fell apart or something. And he's like, yeah, I'm so sorry, we could have won, but that's drifting. And he just goes on. Like, it's just part of his life. If you're on Drift Week and you've saved all your pennies and you're like, man, we're going to try for a baby next year, but I want to do one more try in Drift Week, and like your parents give you a couple grand and like you get like a couple tires from a friend and then your transmission falls out and you don't have a spare. That's worse than Frederick Osbo's transmission, you know, on a personal level, right?
Yeah, no, makes sense.
So that's, for me, the grassroots is equally or more important than the comp stuff. And you need to get in their brain. Like I have these discussions with engineers about things that we're saying, like, you gotta imagine that these people are installing these parts on their mom's driveway in the dark on jack stands with cheap tools. That's what we're looking at.
Yeah, not race
right?
car teams.
No, because that's the easy part. Like they'll have all these tools and all that stuff, and like they'll do it in a well-lit shop and whatever. No, it needs to work for the guy who puts it on the car on his mom's driveway the night before the event, because that's what people do. You know, that's how drifters work. At least 99% of them work that way. So that's also super important. That I wouldn't say idiot-proof because it's just a negative thing to say, but like if you're not like an angle kit aficionado or like an angle kit lover like me, and it's just another part. Like for me, like a brake rotor to me is just another part in my car. I don't have to know anything about the brake rotor, it's just to do its job and it has to fit and blah, 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 right? Angle kits are like that for a lot of people. I'm like, oh man, what's the acronym? Oh man, look at that. Like this is cool, the adjustability like that. People are like, oh, this needs to make angle and it needs to fit, you know, and you have it on stock, all right, ship it out, you know, and you know, that's how people choose angle kits, which is wildly different from how I choose them. So you also need to work with those people and make them happy. And I think that's like a big part of my job, like finding out what's the actual client, right? And how do they perceive drifting and how do they behave in drifting? And I think that's like super important, right? Because that grassroots user, I think that's, to me, especially after doing all these drift weeks, to me that's more interesting actually than the big competition things, to be honest. Yeah. If we can have guys go through drift week with their angle kit and not worry about it, with like all kinds of like, I think I have like 400 pounds of stuff in my car.
I would say that I think that in some ways Drift Week is way harder than like normal competitions and everything on angle kits, because they see 2,000, 3,000 miles of street driving it, you know, sometimes more. They see way more seat time, obviously. They see people that are not maintaining them, they're not checking them, they're not thinking that way, they're not taking their time, they're always pressured to get back on track. And they're typically have nobody helping them.
Exactly.
And they only check this stuff when they're actually vibrating loose or something like that, or breaking.
And then you're already late.
So it is a very different type of clientele and very different. And you're right about the people I think have more invested in a trip like this than they do just like a local comp or like, you know, whatever competition they're doing. Because typically if you're doing a competition series, you're doing a bunch of rounds. And you're not completely invested in each one.
Right. You have a trailer, you can back it on the trailer. Here, you're stuck in West Virginia. So, no, I agree with that. And like, to me, the Drift Week changed my perspective on it, obviously, because Europe doesn't have a lot of street driving and a lot of grassroots.
Yeah.
So in Europe, it's a lot different. Like in Europe, the average angle kit buyer, the person that buys an actual angle kit, which contains a knuckle, a lower control arm, a tie rod, maybe an upper control arm or a top mount, that's 99% of those people are going to be in some kind of competition.
Makes sense.
And in America, if I look at my clients in America, they're not. Like they're just, especially with the Corvette kits, it's a lot of guys that, the Corvette is a typical car that you street drive. And to me, when we started doing the Corvette kit, that was a really big requirement. And that's why there's two versions. There's a version that uses the original arms, which has less angle, but it retains the rubber bushings on the inside of the arm, which is super streetable. I have that on my white C6. And obviously the full balls out FD kit that gives you like 70 degrees of angle that we have on Richard's cars. And to me, that narrow kit was actually almost more important because we had a bunch of cars, obviously, when these kits get developed, there's like a bunch of people that we seek out, that we work with. One of them was, for instance, Ian McDougall, who's here now as well. He had the Corvette kit. We had Zach, Denny, we had Richard, and we had a bunch of other people testing that kit. And it's important for me how that Pro kit works, but I was actually more interested in that narrow kit, right? Because that's something that's never been done before with WiseFab, that we made a kit specifically for that application. We were always looking like, what's the most performance we can get out of a kit? What's the most angle? What's the most grip or the most variable? Like, can we take grip out quickly or not? Ackerman, like what's the Ackerman curve on that kit? What's the rack relocation on that kit? What happens if you crash it into the wall? All these kinds of requirements. But now in America, another requirement was added, which is street driving. And that's why there's the narrow kit now for E30 6046 and the narrow kit for the C6. Because I was specifically,
This goes directly into this. Are y'all's kits like off-road only on a website when you buy them?
Of course, yeah. You should never street drive them at all.
But
obviously.
you do make something for street driving, theoretically, that shouldn't be on the street.
right? You should, there's obviously, it's a race car part, right? But like, I think my car, like I said, this is 6th drift week on that car.
But it never sees on-road use.
My car?
Yeah.
My M3?
Yeah, it's not allowed to. It said off-road when you got it.
Oh, yeah, no, I never was off-road. Well, like, well, you know what I'm saying, right? This is just a disclaimer and that stuff. But like, America is a lot different market than Europe. And I found it out when I did Drift Week 2. And I wrote a big report after Drift Week 2 about the American market for angle kits and how I perceived it. And that was a big thing, like the road driving, which does not exist. If I drive my M3 in my country, it's probably impounded after 10 minutes. And in America, it's like, you know, whatever. Like my car is mild. Fielding street drives his car. And it's just like a Pro-Am car. So you had that plate that said it's legal or something, right? Yes, that's unthinkable in Europe. You wouldn't make it 10 minutes. So, but like that's why WiseFab was always like, all right, this is like a pro angle kit and the buyers were like people that were in a certain competition. And it could have been Grassroots, or it could have been that we have like these days like in like Eastern Europe where they have these Soviet era airstrips where they have these like 200-kilometer-an-hour entries, and it's just a fun practice day, right? But it would be those kind of people that bought those angle kits and not like street driving it like my M3 on a daily basis, because I daily that car as well, obviously, when I'm here. So that was one of my key points. Like in the American market, Americans street drive their cars, so let's cater to that and let's see if we can make a product that works for FD, but will be, because I would say because that C5 that we brought on Drift Week as well has that narrow kit, and those guys love it, and they're used to WiseFab in Europe, because one has a WiseFab E46 and the other has a WiseFab S13, and they drive competition with those cars, and their missile cars are also all on WiseFab. And they drove this Corvette, which has the narrow kit, and they were like, it feels like WiseFab. It's like, so we're not compromising too much. It still has the performance, but that car is as smooth as a normal C6. You couldn't tell. Like, well, obviously the steering is a little more direct, but like if you go over a bumper, over a bad road, it does not feel, you know, AVS, the entry road to AVS, probably the worst road in the world, right? I drove my white C6 there, nothing. Nothing, because the rubbers on the inside of the lower control, they absorb all that stuff.
My last question: does the average drifter in Europe, who's like 20 years old, which I assume there's not a lot of these guys, do they get their drift cars? Like they have to have some type of tow rig, a trailer, a drift car, and then like somewhere to store it, and all these things? Is that a thing just like in America? How do they get their cars there? What do they own? What's like the average? Like you said, you wrote a report on something. If you're going to write a report on like the average drifter,
that's a good question.
In Europe, because the average drifter in Texas has a truck, trailer, drift car, somewhere to put it most likely, and then obviously somewhere to work on it, probably enclosed.
Well, that's the big difference between Europe and America, obviously, that I know kids here from Texas that are my clients that are 21, 23 years old, and they order fuel suspension, they order WiseFab, they order a bunch of spares all in one setting. And they're just 22-year-old kids, and some of them may have reached parents, but there's also kids that have like a wrap shop, or they're like a truck driver. I have a lot of truck drivers as clients for some reason. And they don't come from money, and they just buy these parts. And if I look at the client profile in Europe, somebody who buys 2A shocks, WiseFab front and rear, that's usually either a rich person, so a younger kid with family money, or it's somebody like Lars and Niels who are business owners who are in their 40s who work 6 days a week. who have multiple sources of income. So that's the big difference that people really don't get, because like the buying power of the Americans is so much higher, especially the local economies in California and Texas are so strong. And I can really tell because I retail on both continents, right? And I retail the exact same stuff. So we sell quick changes over here. I sell quick changes in Europe. I got Jackson, you know, who was on Drift Week with his E36. He orders this thing, he orders that, you know, I just want good stuff. You know, he's 25 or 26, something like that. That does not exist in Europe, you know. People like that are just blue collar guys. He restores cars and he restores muscle cars and whatever.
Jackson Orr?
Yeah. Okay. So, but like that's the thing, right? That doesn't exist in Europe, that kind of buying power. And like a house in Texas, let's say a house but somewhere between Houston and DFW that has a 2-car garage and a little bit of land that you can turn your trailer around, that's a 1.5 to 2 million euro house in most of Western Europe. And mortgages work a lot different in Western Europe, and you know, that's impossible to get that. It's like a normal 21-year-old kid doesn't exist, right? So that's the big difference, like the buying power of these young people. And like they'll have like an E36 and they'll use like they'll be like a plumber or an electrician, and they use like their van that they have from their employer in the weekends to tow like a $2,000 trailer to a missile event and have like their E36.
Do they rent the trailer, or do they have some place to store it?
But that's the problem. Like in
Amsterdam, where would they put it?
They put it somewhere in somebody's meadow, farmer's field or something like that. But like it's just so much different than in America, because I was like blown away with like how these drifters have like, because obviously here, like if you're in certain parts of the country, stuff is like over here, I can't imagine houses are ridiculously expensive. They may cost some money, but it's not like insane. And you can easily quadruple that in Europe for
probably really cheap out here.
Yeah, and like just to buy a truck, let's say I own your truck, right? Your Ford truck. That would probably cost me 300 to 400 euros a month in Europe, just ownership. Just registering it to my name, the taxation, everything is 300 to 400 a month. And people say like, yeah, but in Europe they make a lot more money. They don't. The median income in Europe is lower than in America, and stuff is way more expensive. If I do grocery shopping here, it's 20 to 40% cheaper, and all the packages are bigger, right? So it's even more different. And I can go do it at 4 a.m., right, at Walmart or
You also live in an extremely expensive city.
Yeah, but like there's not like, it's like 10% cheaper in the countryside. But like if I want to go from Amsterdam to the countryside, it's 100 euros in fuel.
Your prostitutes are probably cheaper.
I mean,
and your drugs.
I don't know what does the prostitutes cost over here in West Virginia.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think crack has really pushed down the price of the average blowjob. Probably helped the economy.
Probably could. I mean, it's local economy. It's very strong. But anyways, yeah, so that's the thing, you know. And a lot of Americans that I interact with on social media, they really don't have a clue, right? And you see these memes, they're like, oh, my European friends is laughing and having like 6 weeks of holiday a year. Yeah. They're 40 and they're living with their parents. You know, it's literally, that's why I like being here, right? Because if you don't do shit in America, sure, you'll end up in the gutter. But if you want to you don't even have to be Einstein or LZ, who's a brilliant businessman and a hard worker, to be successful over here. You can be like 1% of LZ and still have a house and a car and a trailer and an S13, right? In Europe, you need to be LZ to do those things. And that's the difference, right? There's obviously the top of the drifters, but like the huge grassroots that you guys have in Texas and that we have in California, and it exists in Englishtown and in the Pacific Northwest, that's not there in Europe because of that buying power. They're all guys like Lars and Niels who are here right now, who've been to Ebisu, who are now doing Drift Week, who have a pro car, who have a bunch of missile cars. They have their vans and their trailers and their own little shop, and they have all this shit together. But you would consider them like guys that are like probably top 5% in my country. If you look at normal working people, obviously not talking about billionaires or whatever. And it's very hard for young people to get there, right? Because housing prices are insane in Europe because they're not building enough houses. Cars are insanely expensive to have. Real estate is expensive, so exactly where you're going to leave that trailer, where you're going to work on that car. Electricity bills are insane. Like we had families that paid 200 euros a month that now pay 1,000 euros a month in electricity bill, and it's just it's maybe a 1,200 square foot house, you know, and you're out $1,000 a month to heat it. So, and the wages are really not that much higher.
So we covered 5 questions in what, Si, 2 hours?
80 minutes.
Dang, good job. All right, we're done. Good job.
How many hours did we do?
2.5.
You owe me sushi.
No, I've seen you order sushi before. You're not good at it.
That was not my